Hi guys, since I can't be here with you to go over chapter 14 because I'm in a conference in Denver, I wanted to give you guys the opportunity to have a video recorded lecture of this particular chapter. Chapter 14 is the last chapter we're covering before this next lecture exam, and I just wanted to make sure that rather than just have the notes for the lecture to study for, that you actually had even just a short recording of me giving a lecture for this particular chapter. So I've upgraded my equipment. I've got the audio and the webcam going now this time, so I can give you an actual video recorded lecture and not just the audio recorded lecture that I gave you guys last time. Alright, so I'm going to switch over here and let's go ahead and talk about chapter 14, which is about speciation and extinction. Alright, so first of all, what is a species? So you've heard me talk about this term lots of different times, but we've never sort of defined it, so we're going to define it very specifically now. A species is a distinct group of living things, and what makes species different from each other is that species are only capable of mating and reproducing with each other, those in their own species, but not with anyone else outside of the species. So that's why we see all of this great diversity of different birds and different plants and even different types of bacteria. We see a whole host of different species living on this planet. Again, what makes them unique and distinct is the fact that they have that blueprint, that genetic DNA that we've been discussing, that is unique to them as a species, and it can't be shared amongst other groups of living things. So what produced all of this great diversity that we see, all of these individual species and groups? A lot of it has to do with what we've been discussing in the previous chapter. It's all about evolution, and it's all about the small evolutionary changes that have accumulated in these populations over time. We call those small changes in allele frequencies, which we discussed when we talked about natural selection in the last chapter, we refer that as microevolution. So populations are changing. They are maybe acquiring new traits, or perhaps one trait is becoming more common than another trait. And all of those changes in allele frequencies happen on a small microscopic scale. We call it microevolution. Eventually, however, if enough change occurs that two organisms are no longer capable of breeding with each other anymore, then what we have is we have something called macroevolution. This is where we see actually new species evolving. So a little bit about how things are classified very quickly. So when we are classifying things, we are classifying them based on a system that was laid out several hundred years ago by someone by the name of Carolus Linnaeus, and he created a system of scientific, what we call nomenclature, which is just a really big word that means we have a very scientific, specific way of naming things. And the way that we do this is that every species is given a two-part name. The first part is the group they belong to, which is called their genus, and then along with their genus we give them a specific species name. So for example, Homo sapiens, our genus is Homo. We belong to the group of Homo, which were all human-like groups that used to be here. They have all since gone extinct, but if you have ever heard of Homo erectus or Homo ergaster or some of the other Homo sapiens groups, those were groups that we shared. Now it's just us. Now we're just Homo sapiens, which means wise man, by the way, if you didn't know that. So again, what makes each species unique is the fact that you can only have offspring, fertile offspring, with members of your own group, and you can't have offspring with anybody else. So you, for example, if you have two different species of lady beetles, okay, and they might look very, very similar. They might have similar red and black patches, and you might think, oh, those are the exact same type of beetles. But as it turns out, if they can't breed together, if they can't make offspring that can then go on to have their own offspring, we consider them to be completely separate, distinct groups. I'm going to skip that chapter because I just said that. Another way that we can define species is we can actually look at their DNA and their sequences. So, for example, we've kind of talked already about how our DNA, as a reminder, is the set of instructions on how to build and maintain an organism. And so what we know is that each organism, each species then, would have kind of their own set of instructions. They're not going to be identical to everyone else's, but they're going to be similar. And it's actually more similar than you might think. There are a whole host of, let's see if I talked about that. Oh, I didn't talk about that. I'm sorry, I apologize. There are several species that we share a lot of our DNA in common with. So our closest living relatives are the primates. And so if you think of orangutans and chimpanzees in particular, we share a lot of our genetic sequence with them. We share upwards of 90% of our DNA we have in common. And so we know that there are a lot of genetic similarities between us. And that, again, from an evolutionary standpoint, makes sense because our ancestors were more closely related to each other than we were related to other groups of living things. Okay, so I will mention this one. Sometimes I have to decide whether or not I want to talk about a slide or not. So how do new species form? So how did we get all of this diversity? Well, what happens is we have a population, or two subpopulations as we're calling them, and at some point they began to be separated from each other. And as they began to become separated from each other, slowly over time they began to accumulate their own genetic differences. So we say that the gene pools of these two populations became isolated. And over long periods of time, generations, hundreds of thousands of generations, we see that the little tiny mutations and mistakes that are common begin to accumulate. And sometimes, if there are enough differences between those two groups, that eventually they will go on to form different species. So the biggest thing that prevents two species from reproducing with each other is this idea of reproductive barriers. And these barriers can occur at different times. They can either occur before reproduction, which we call pre-zygotic barriers, or they can actually happen after reproduction has begun. So they're called post-zygotic barriers. So in the case of pre-zygotic barriers are things that, like, for example, if you have two different species, and let's say one species is active during the day and another species is active during the night. Well, obviously they're never going to reproduce because they never come in contact with each other. Similarly would be things like habitat isolation. If they don't actually physically come into contact with each other because of where they live, well, that would be a type of barrier as well. Sometimes the barriers happen to do with behaviors. So birds, for example, are very specific about their mating rituals and the way in which that they attract mates. Sometimes it's by calls, sometimes it's by particular, like a mating dance that they do. And if you don't have the same song, mating song, or if you don't understand it or you don't know that dance, you'll never come together to mate anyway. So those are different types of behavioral isolations. With the post-zygotic, this is after reproduction has actually occurred. So let's say these two species did come together and they were able to actually mate. The problem now, though, is that sometimes the offspring that has been produced, the zygote, sometimes it fails to develop, so you don't actually have an offspring being born at all. Other times the hybrid does actually get to a point where it can be born, but it can't reproduce because it's completely sterile, so it has no ability to pass those genes on to another generation. So again, this is sort of a nice chart from your textbook that actually goes through those different types of both pre-zygotic and post-zygotic reproductive barriers. So again, they're different things to think of. So sterility is a big one. So yes, lions and tigers, for example, can actually mate with each other. And you get this liger, but the liger isn't fertile, so ligers can't make more ligers, if that makes sense. So this is, again, kind of an example a lot of people bring up with hybrids, that yes, different species are capable sometimes of reproducing with each other and having an offspring, but that offspring can't make copies of itself. And if you remember, the conditions for being alive is being able to make a copy of yourself. So that's why they're not considered their own species in that case. There are two different types of what we call speciation. So there's two different patterns of when new species do occur. Here's the two different ways that typically happen. In the first example we're going to talk about, allopatric speciation. This happens when a physical geographic barrier pops up between two populations of the same species. So in this case, we have these lovely flowers, the yellow flowers and the purple flowers. And let's say this huge mountain range popped up in between them. Well, obviously the yellow flowers and the purple flowers used to be the same species, but they can't reproduce anymore, so we can't cross these plants with each other anymore. And so the gene pools become isolated and they become distinct. And if enough changes have happened over time that once we put these two plants back in contact with each other, if they can't have offspring anymore, then they will be two separate species. Islands are really actually good at doing this. So really good examples of Darwin's finches, if you're familiar with the example of Darwin's finches, which hopefully I will tell you about during a lecture in chapter 12, but I haven't taught that yet to you guys, so I'm kind of getting ahead of myself with this lecture. But in any case, Darwin's finches there was a finch on the mainland, and it had made its way out to the different Galapagos Islands, and over time it became isolated from all the other populations of finches. And so what you have, where you have species of these finches, these birds, that became very adapted to their own particular islands, so much so that they had physical characteristics and traits which made them incompatible with the finches from other islands. So islands have a good way of isolating populations. The other type of speciation occurs is something called sympatric speciation. This is just when we have the populations diverge from each other even though they are still in contact with each other. This could happen for a variety of different reasons. Let's say that you had an environment where you were kind of on a slope, and you had plants that were high on the slope and plants that were low on the slope, and the plants that were low on the slope got a lot more rain, and the plants that were high on the slope got a lot more sunlight. And so there could be very small micro differences in the environment that could continue to lead to these allele frequencies changing over time and eventually speciation. So how often or how quickly does this occur? Well, that's up for some debate. We used to think that it was a very gradual process. We used to favor this idea of gradualism, which meant that it would take a long time for species to very slowly and eventually change and to become new species. But when we look at the fossil record, we actually see that's not true. Instead, what we see is that the fossil record is marked by several periods of huge explosions of species, most likely in accordance with when there was large changes to the environment and new species were rapidly able to adapt to those changes and then to be successful. And then I talked about that, and I'm going to move quickly because I only have a little bit of time left before my recording is going to punch me out. So this idea of a mass extinction events, again, is where we see a lot of speciation events occurring. So the dinosaurs ruled your planet for millions and millions of years, and when they went extinct, mammals had a major competitive advantage because in the new environment, they were able to be successful where the dinosaurs were not, and they all died out. So this happened frequently throughout the fossil record. Let's see, in the last minute here, you can go through here and talk about why the dinosaurs passed because of impact theory and the meteorite and so on and so forth. The last thing I'm going to leave you guys with from this chapter is we are in the midst of the sixth great mass extinction, and the problem is not an asteroid or anything hitting the planet. It just happens to be people and what we are doing to the planet. We'll talk a lot more about extinction in a future chapter coming up. So when we're going to talk about biodiversity and all the things occurring on the planet, I'll talk a lot more about extinction. So I'm going to kind of pass over this system, but you should be familiar with classification systems as well. And that's where I'm going to leave it to you guys. And don't worry about cladograms. We don't need to know them.